Here we go. It's recording now.
So please maybe shortly introduce the piece, your piece called Microscopic Dances.
Thanks, Andres. Yeah. So Microscopic Dances came out of a sort of bigger idea I had for a project working with Drake Music Scotland, and they're an organisation that work with musicians with disabilities, and they work all over Scotland, and they were kind of a partner organisation from Drake Music, which is based in England, and Scotland has its own version of that, and that sort of created its own network of creative activity. And I suppose their interest is in creating brand new works specifically for musicians with disabilities. And I really got involved in this organisation because I'd been working with a company in Austria, in Innsbruck, for a number of years called Medical Electronica, and they created cochlear implants, basically. So I was actually there as a music consultant. I wrote a number of bits of music for deaf people, for people with cochlear implants. So I've had a long interest in inclusive music making, creating music for people with disabilities. And I guess when I got involved with Drake Music Scotland, it was around the time of the London Olympics in 2012. And they asked me to create this project for an ensemble of peers, of young people all of the same age, roughly the same age, with these new digital technologies alongside acoustic instruments. So it's working with musicians from a music school in Scotland, in Edinburgh, City of Edinburgh Music School. And we teamed up with musicians from Drake Music Scotland who were using technologies, which I'll maybe come back to in a minute. But I suppose the idea was to try and find a way so that they were integrated within the ensemble, so that you would have somebody like myself acting as a composer, director, conductor, but actually all of the musicians had the same sort of autonomy, the same kind of power over the ensemble, within the ensemble. And that first project was successful. It was a huge success. We performed several times the piece. We would perform it and have a conversation and then discuss it again. And we had a big audience for it, and there was all sorts of different sort of aspects of research that came out of that, and articles and things too. But the big thing for me was it led on to this other bigger piece called Microscopic Dances. I can tell you a little bit about why it was called Microscopic Dances. That was my musical idea behind it. And I wrote a bit of text about it, really, to describe it. But I suppose it was about this idea about these sort of procedures that your brain goes through on its way to performing music. And I suppose when you see an orchestra sitting on stage, they could be playing something really loud, but actually there's not much physical movement. It looks like people are almost sort of frozen. If you're a trumpet player from a distance, it doesn't look like you're doing very much, but you are actually doing a huge amount as musicians. You're thinking, your brain's sort of interpreting pitches and rhythms and dynamics and articulations from a page of music, which is a kind of complex language. And then it's realizing all of these sounds through all of these tiny muscle movements and making decisions about the attack, sustain of individual notes, moving between each one. You may be looking at sheet music or listening to other people around you. You're focusing on a conductor or a director, and then you're using your ears to decide when to join in with other musicians. So there's all these really complex things that musicians have to do. And for me, it seemed to be about these tiny movements and processes which are all invisible, which is where I came up with this idea of these sort of microscopic dances between our neural processes and our physical capabilities as musicians, between the sound that's produced. So I was creating these individual movements in the piece, which are sort of, I suppose, a series of small dances, kind of invisible dances. And that was my creative idea to get into the piece itself. So each of the movements of the piece are named after a dance, basically. So there's a waltz, but I've called it like a clandestine waltz, so something that's hidden away, or a secluded Charleston, for example. What else have I got there? An invisible fandango. or a veiled saraband. They're sort of maybe taking these ideas of dances which are maybe modern or quite old, and then thinking a way to sort of hide the musical material within them. So hide the musical idea, or imagining what it would be like if they were you heard them from a distance, or you could barely make out what sort of dance they were, basically. And that was that was the idea to the piece. Is that enough information just now?
I have a question. Were there particular disabilities at the center of the concept, or?
Yes. So I worked with the first piece that I wrote, Technophonia. We did in 2012. I should say that the Microscopic Dances we did in 2017, but in 2012 we worked with some musicians like Chris Jacquin, who's a regular musician with Drake Music Scotland. Also Rona Smith as well, and some others. And the thing is that part of what the organisation want to do is set up a situation where you have this kind of career trajectory, so people can be part of an orchestra. And from this original piece, Technophonia, we tried it with a quartet of musicians. They then formed a digital quartet, and then they began to build on that to the point where now there is a digital orchestra that work with Drake Music Scotland. And in Microscopic Dances, I wrote for the digital orchestra. So that was a group of sort of 10 or 12 digital musicians, plus also another 10, 15 acoustic musicians as well with that. So I guess it's about, the musicians involved in that early stage kind of were helping build their skills to move forwards. And Chris Jacquin, for example, Chris has cerebral palsy, as does Rona Smith. So they have kind of limitations of what they're able to do with their movements, I guess. So they would use very particular technologies to enable them to engage with it musically, and they have a very different approach to how they perform. And I guess I have to think very carefully about that as a composer. So I guess if somebody has never walked, for example, because walking is the most obvious way for us as humans to discover rhythm. The fact is you're able to just do this repetitive movement. That's how we would learn that. If you've never had the opportunity to walk, how do you pick that up? How do you learn that idea of a steady pulse? And then you obviously have issues over how your brain talks to your body. So that kind of sustains rhythmic content to a piece is very difficult to realize. And it then means as a composer, I have to think carefully about how I would encourage someone like Rona or Chris to engage with very rhythmic music, whether there has to be a certain amount of flexibility built into the score in the way that I compose it.
Yes, right. It was one disability was common for Ron and Chris. It was about disability to move, right? Correctly?
Yeah.
Some other musicians who has some disabilities as well.
Yes. So there was also a number of musicians maybe who had autism, or people who had learning difficulties and difficulty sort of processing maybe conventional notation. So I guess a lot of the work we did was using something like figure notes notation. I know we've spoken about someone like Markku in Finland, but figure notes was really useful. So thinking about ways as a composer that you could capture your musical ideas or on a score and present it to somebody who maybe doesn't have the same sort of understanding by looking at a page of conventional notation. I mean, again, the thing is there were all sorts of different ways that people were processing that musical information there. So I would say the barriers were not impossible to overcome. We just found a way of working with the individuals and collaborating with everyone to allow it to happen. Yeah.
So people with movement disabilities, autism, what else?
Well, I suppose if there's cognitive disabilities as well. I mean, I suppose those are the two types of disabilities, really, aren't they? So people, I mean, someone like Chris and Rona are kind of have this physical disability, but their cognition is extremely advanced, and they both have degrees, and they're very intelligent people, and they have an understanding of music, and they can read music actually. So they were reading from conventional notation, but there were people who had sort of specific learning difficulties who maybe didn't have the
Right.
cognitive function to read some of the standard notation. So I
Right.
guess, yeah, as a musician, you're trying to find a way to present that to allow
Right.
people to engage with it. Yeah.
And how did you empower, right, Chris and Ronald? How it happened? What kind of methods or methodology?
That's a really good question. I mean, one of the things I did, and actually the thing that I learned from my first project, big project, Technophonia, was things to develop. So, for example, that idea of being the leader of an ensemble. And in the first project I did, it felt very much like you had an orchestra of people who were kind of normal musicians, who were acoustic musicians, who had regular, no identifiable disability. And then you had this group of people at the front who were sort of highlighted in some way. And I think in the second piece, Microscopic Dances, I was really eager to try and change that dynamic. So it didn't feel like you were sort of showing somebody up as being, this is the special person with a disability. We're about trying to integrate everybody in the ensemble. So that idea of thinking about the leader of an ensemble was important. It could be anybody. The idea of sort of a flexibility of tempo and meter. So as I've described, if you have a cognitive disability or a physical disability, there may be some barrier about aspects of regular meter, regular tempo. This idea of the integration of the digital instruments into a larger ensemble. So thinking about the layout of the group. So instead of it being, soloists with disabilities at the front, can we sort of move people around so everybody is mixed together as peers? Really important. Maybe thinking about the role of the instruments over the passage of time, so how they might change. So some people might be soloists, some people might accompany each other, that's okay. And maybe also giving instrumentalists control over aspects of the structure of the piece. So, for example, Chris or Rona could then choose the duration, how long they spend over something, how much musical expression they put into something to guide the structure of the piece. And then actually, I as a conductor or director can follow them, and other musicians can follow them. So thinking about autonomy and control and giving people the power, I guess, to choose the direction of the piece or how long they spend on something. That was really important.
Yes. And what about the second, right? So we talk about now about Chris and Ronald, who has this movement disabilities, but about the second, right? So there is a musicians who has autism and other cognitive disabilities. What about them? How they were involved?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think, for example, there may be musicians who didn't read the conventional notation. And what I would spend time with them doing was actually trying to help them understand a route through the piece. So actually, it's such a big part to be included in an ensemble. And again, if you don't have notation to help you navigate your way around it, it's a lot to take on. So maybe we talk about ways to learn the piece. So it's learning by memory, possibly. It was maybe giving them very simple signals. So perhaps me as a conductor helping them understand how they would join the other musicians, how they would stop. Maybe there were sort of visual signals on a piece of paper. Some people had support staff with them, somebody sitting next to them, helping guide them as well. Actually, that was quite important. So we had sort of a leaders within ensembles. So, for example, a group of people with iPads, and there was one person who had felt more confident would be leading them, and then actually they could look at each other and say now. So I was kind of, in a way, I didn't really like the term conductor. I was the sort of person who was helping direct it, but I was kind of trying to pull all of these individuals together at the same time. Yeah, does that answer the question?
Yes. Yes. And what kind of technologies did you use that
Yeah,
covered them, right? Or somehow uh, for them it would be much easier to be part of the ensemble.
yeah. So in the first piece I did, Technophonia, we made use of something called sound beam, which is this ultrasonic beam that you break with a hand, or anything. You could drive a wheelchair in between the beam. And it's like a big sort of invisible keyboard in the sky, so that where your limb or hand or anything cuts that beam, you can control how high or low the pitch might be, or the type of instrumental sound that comes out. We also had an instrument called the Skoog, which is developed in Edinburgh, and it's like this sort of foam cube, basically, with coloured sides that you could press. We also used an instrument called Brainfingers. So Brainfingers is this sort of band that fits around the forehead, and it picks up very small electrical signals from your sort of brain or from very small muscle movements. So for somebody who's got maybe limited movement, like Chris, if he could use his jaw muscle like this, actually the electronic pulses picked up by the muscles of the jaw would trigger this band, and then we could use that to trigger a music program. So actually for Chris and Rona, they do a lot of that, and we linked that up to a program called Notion. So what I would do is I could put in a big orchestral score, and actually Chris could sort of trigger it and play through parts of it. So that became a really important part of it too. There were other instruments like, say, electronic drum kits. I know one of our musicians, Stephen, in Microscopic Dances, played electronic drum kit, and he was very, very good at keeping a steady rhythm. And again, I just had to teach him by ear about the sort of shape of the piece overall. So there were all these different technologies, keyboards as well, and sort of synthesizer sounds. We maybe used figure notes technology on the keys of synthesizers, and then other sounds were triggered by a keyboard. Yeah.
Got it. And what was your motivation to create the piece?
That's a good question. I mean, I suppose I've mentioned before that I've had a long history, I suppose, of working with individuals. Like, I love working with individuals, and I'm very aware that everyone's different. If you've met one person with a disability, you've met one person with a disability. One person might be interested in one type of music, the next person is interested in something completely different. And for me, that's a really interesting part of being a musician. The fact that I find it quite inspirational to sort of share ideas in a space with somebody. I don't find it particularly creative to be sitting in a room by myself with a blank sheet of manuscript paper. I don't find that as creative as I do by actually having conversations with somebody else, finding out what they like, what it motivates them, and then finding our shared interests and working out how we might build something together. So I suppose all of my work comes out of that, really, whether that was working with deaf people through Medel in Austria, or if it was working with individuals like Chris or Rona with Drake Music Scotland. So I suppose finding out what interests them, trying some musical ideas, and then thinking about how I can build that into a larger structure or a larger piece, basically. I love music with layers. I love lots of different things that don't go together or shouldn't go together. And that's really interesting for me too. If you've got one person who loves one particular type of music, to then think about how I can put it together with something that shouldn't really fit, that's quite inspirational for me.
And how cooperation with this ensemble, right? How it shapes the piece, right? How it happened. And
yeah, so for Microscopic Dances, we had quite a big group of musicians. We had 25 musicians on stage, and a lot of them were drawn from the National Youth Orchestra of Scotland, actually, with the group, the acoustic musicians, I guess, for the piece. And I knew that young people are very open-minded, actually. There's always in music circles, we talk a lot about how sort of older musicians can be a bit more resistant to change, a bit more resistant to trying new ways of working, or being open-minded, or just throwing themselves into a new concept for a piece. But I love working with young musicians because actually everything is new music to them. So it doesn't matter whether it's Beethoven or Oliver Searle, it's actually all new. So that was quite inspirational. So a lot of the piece in Microscopic Dances, a lot of the music, I asked them to improvise at points. So I gave them sort of a structure and say, continue in this way.
Yes.
And especially that helps with the flexibility of working with somebody like Chris or Stephanie. So if they take a bit longer to create, to end a phrase, for example, or they're taking their time, then I say to the young musicians, well, just continue this. You've got the material there. Just carry on until Stephanie's finished, and we'll see where we get to. So they're actually able to help structure the pieces themselves too. And that was a really big part of the piece. Again, that idea of giving them some control over the structure and the phrasing and the shape of the music itself.
Yes, yes, yes. And let's say what you learn, right? What you learn working with them, right?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, I learned a lot actually talking to them. I mean, again, that idea of what they enjoyed doing, what they were able to do. I suppose finding particular approaches for them by having those discussions. Yeah, I mean, it's always slightly different if you're working with a group of young musicians. I suppose they're not professionals. There's a kind of educational aspect there too. So I suppose a lot of what I was talking to them about would be about the style of pieces. So, for example, I've got one movement in Microscopic Dances which is about it kind of a tango, infinitesimal tangos. It's like very small tango ideas that sort of goes on forever. So I talked to them a little bit about the style of that, how you would play that, and they may not have that knowledge already because they're maybe 17 years old. They've never done it. How would you improvise a tango? So actually, my role there was kind of as an educator as well, where I would say, try this material, try playing it like this, try phrase it like this, think about this when you're performing it, and that became a lot of the discussion, basically.
Yes, and you previously mentioned, right, that working with people with various disabilities, it just somehow working with people with different perspectives, right? So that they can look on music differently. Maybe from that piece, what was some kind of for you is for yourself some kind of new musical discoveries, right?
Yeah.
Because working with somebody who musical work seem quite different from others.
It's a good point. I mean, one of the big things that came out of it was I was making a list actually of the things that you do as a performing musician, and like I mentioned before in my sort of idea for microscopic dances, this idea of these neural processes and how they manifest themselves for musicians through sound. Similarly, I would be thinking about the roles of the performing musicians. So I feel like I really learned a lot about that. And I made a list of the things that we do as musicians and that you have to do. And for me, it became a real kind of philosophical sort of exploration of music and of performing music and what musicians do to perform music. So, for example, the fact that people sometimes get the main melody in the music, sometimes they don't. Sometimes you have to follow someone else's tempo, someone else's direction, and sometimes you have to provide some musical material in the background. Sometimes you accompany someone else. Sometimes you're doing something that's less important, so you have to be quieter than other people. Sometimes you have to play something that you don't even hear at a point. Sometimes you have to listen to someone across the room from you or make eye contact with more than one person at once when you're doing that. Or think about how your part works within the larger ensemble. And sometimes you actually have to do nothing. Sometimes you just have to count in your head, actually. So for me, I really began to think about the role of musicians and how they fit within an ensemble, and that's definitely helped inform my practice as a composer with other works, whatever they are. Since then, I would say.
And what message does communicate this piece, right?
That that's a difficult thing to sum up, actually. I mean, I'd hope that it it says that it's possible to include anybody in a piece of music. I mean, I think that's what I'd like. I'd like to think that you can show that anybody can be a musician, and that people can work within an ensemble of musicians, whoever you are. And I think for me, that's the really big part of it, actually, is that you can, and also that you can be creative with whatever is available to you. So as a composer, I'm always thinking about, what are the creative possibilities for the instruments that you have. So for some of these digital instruments, some of them have very simple sort of ways of performing, or simple kind of methods of creating sound, actually. And it's really to do with how you link them up to another device that will give you all of these other creative possibilities. But I was also really interested in how you can push someone's kind of physical, cognitive capabilities as a musician. So unfortunately, very rarely do people with disabilities get pushed to try something difficult. It's actually a really difficult topic. If you say, I'm trying to create something that's really hard for this person with a disability, I want to make it difficult for you. That's a really difficult discussion for people to have in society, actually. And for me, that's a really big part of it, actually. I want to get people to create or to engage with something that seems difficult, so that you have to find a way to practice it and get better at doing what you're doing. And I think that should be possible for anybody, even if you have no disability, or if you do, really, if you've got limitations over what instrument you can have or hold, that you can find something that's difficult to help yourself get better.
Got it. Got it. And last question: what compositional ideas are used in this piece?
Well, yes. I mean, I suppose I've mentioned a bit of that already, haven't I? About this idea of tiny dances. I mean, one of the things I love, as I said, was this idea of putting things together that don't fit, or putting different types of musical material together. And I also am a bit of a butterfly, so I love moving between different types of music really quickly. And what I loved about a piece like this is I've got maybe 7 or 8 different movements in it, and they're all very different. So in Microscopic Dances, I take the idea of a dance called a jitterbug, so something very, very fast, 1920s dance music. So lots of really strong rhythms, sort of jazz feel to it, and these different kind of rhythmic layers. And then the next one, I have this tango, infinitesimal tango, which has got this very atmospheric feel to it, and this kind of endless sort of cycling of a chord sequence. There's even ideas from a kind of film music. So there's one called a Piri Passacalia, which has got taking an idea from actually 1970s film music, or something that's very, very repetitive, and it's got that kind of 1970s funk feel to it, actually. But then I'm trying to bring my own kind of imagination, my own style of music into it as well. I'm a big fan of rock and metal music. So actually, there's one movement called a minuscule mosh, where everybody just kind of goes a bit crazy and starts sort of almost pretending like they're having these little sort of heavy metal moments between themselves, basically. So there's all these ideas that really appeal to me as a musician, and I love the idea of putting them all together into one piece, which is something I do quite a lot, actually.
One more, but this will be the final question.
That's okay.
Yeah, and the final question is, maybe can you give 3 suggestions to composers who would like to start writing or collaborating with musicians who has some disabilities?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the first big one for me would be speak to people. And as I said before, I think once you've met one person with a disability, you've met one person with a disability. So everybody is very different. Everybody's tastes are very different. Everybody will want to work in a different way. So my first thing would be just have conversations with people. I would also say, think about, if somebody has a sort of cognitive physical disability that prevents them from engaging with an acoustic instrument, that should not be a barrier to creating music. So just because you're not able to hold a cello, that doesn't mean that you can't be a musician. So maybe it's up to us as composers to think creatively, to find ways that individuals can engage with creative music making, engage with new music, actually. New music should not just be something that is performed by acoustic groups in a concert hall or something like that. You should be able to find ways to put it into a non-standard space, and not worry about the kind of set way of working that is regularly established by the regular concert ensembles, I suppose. And I suppose the final thing would be about retaining some of your own personality as a composer and musician. For me, that's really important, that even though I'm writing music that is sometimes maybe quite humorous for an environment like this, it has an element of humor about it because I want to tell a story, I want to engage people of all ages and stages. For me, it's got to be about retaining my own musical personality. So still, even if I'm writing something that sounds quite accessible, it has my musical personality in it. I want to retain that. And that's a really important thing to try and do as a young composer.
Thank you very much.
Is that helpful? Is that all you need? Shall I press stop on this recording? Is that okay?